You're listening to the Scrum Dynamics Podcast, episode 13 on the CRM Audio Network. Welcome to the Scrum Dynamics Podcast. Our mission is to help every Microsoft partner and customer use the Scrum framework to successfully implement Dynamics 365. Hey there, and welcome back to another episode of the Scrum Dynamics Podcast. I'm your host, Neil Benson. In this episode, I'm planning to deep dive into sprint planning. Boom, see what I did there? But just before we get started, I wanted to thank our sponsor, the Dynamics 365 User Group. D365 UG is run for Dynamics customers by Dynamics customers. I recently ran a giveaway competition for a ticket to the D365 UG Summit in Phoenix, which runs from October 15th to 18th, less than 2 months away. Congratulations to Michael Hawk from Florida. I've just booked my own flights, so I'll see you in Phoenix, Mike. Summit is packed with over 300 sessions covering the Dynamics 365 and Microsoft Power Platforms, as well as networking sessions, and it's a great chance to meet independent software vendors, Microsoft program team members, other customers, partners, and Microsoft MVPs. I can't wait, and I hope to see you there too. Check out d365ugsummit.com before September 6th to save $200 on your registration. So what is sprint planning? Sprint planning is the first Scrum event in each sprint, and it occupies the first few hours of the sprint itself. It's held immediately after the previous sprint's sprint retrospective. In sprint planning, we forecast what we can build this sprint, and how we're going to build it. It involves the whole Scrum team, the product owner, the development team, and it's facilitated by the Scrum Master. If the product owner has proxies or delegates, they're usually in the workshop as well, but I've never had other stakeholders attend sprint planning. I've had business analysts who are proxies or delegates of the product owner join us in the sprint planning workshop, but I've never had other stakeholders attend sprint planning. By the end of sprint planning, you should have a clear goal and a sprint backlog, which Dermot and I covered in episode 12. How long is sprint planning? Sprint planning is time-boxed at up to 1 day if you're running a 1-month sprint. So for a 3-week sprint, it's about 6 hours. For a 2-week sprint, it's about 4 hours. And for a 1-week sprint, it's 2 hours. Another way of saying that, multiply the number of weeks in your sprint by 2 to determine the time box for your sprint planning workshop. What happens during sprint planning? Sprint planning has 2 parts. In part 1, the product owner shares the sprint goal, and together with the development team, they agree a sprint goal and discuss the high-value items at the top of the product backlog. And then in part 2, the development team forecasts the items it will complete in the sprint and how they're going to do it. So let's take a look at part 1. So first of all, the product owner shares the candidate sprint goal with the development team. Ideally, there's a single goal, but often there's a couple. Great goals provide a theme for all the high-value user stories the team should build in this sprint. An example of a sprint goal might be that we're able to display the customer record in Unified Service Desk when there's an incoming call, or complete the reports and dashboards in Power BI. Bad goals are things like complete all the stories for the sprint, or complete these 7 different completely unrelated epics. Your product owner shouldn't just be announcing the sprint goal, it's a negotiation with the development team. They should be asking questions, clarifying the desired outcomes, and driving out any ambiguity. In the end, it's the Scrum team who arrives at the sprint goal together. And if you can capture the sprint goal in a single sentence, that's great. I've not been able to do that in every sprint on every project, and I'm still alive, but it's great if you can. Some of my teams have set themselves a stretch goal for a sprint. They maybe identify a couple of extra product backlog items or a minor goal they're willing to push themselves for in order to achieve. This works well in a couple of situations. I find that whenever the team's got quite a few competitive type people in it, and none of the team hate any level of competition, and when the product owner has a competitive streak, often when you're deploying Dynamics 365 into a sales organization and the product owner is from the sales organization and the rest of the team have got some level of competition, it can work pretty well. But most of the time, Dynamics 365 implementers are not the type of people with the personalities that rise to the challenge of stretch goals. And given that the greatest Scrum teams work at a sustainable pace for months and years even, Stretch goals are usually a bad idea. But it's really up to your team if you want to try using a stretch goal and then examine how it went in your next retrospective. So the product owner then walks through all the high value items at the top of the sprint backlog. These should have all been recently reviewed at the last story time meeting or the backlog refinement meeting immediately preceding the sprint planning work. The most recent story time session preceding the sprint planning workshop. You'll also have reviewed it at the sprint review from the last sprint, where the rest of the stakeholders got to help you adjust the sprint backlog too. Now is a great time to refine any new stories or unrefined ones. Every product backlog item at this stage should meet your team's definition of ready before the team can take them into the sprint backlog. Dermot and I discussed the definition of ready in episode 12. So that's part 1 of the sprint planning workshop. That normally takes about half of the time for a sprint planning workshop, and at that point our product owner quite often leaves the rest of the development team alone to get on with part 2. In part 2, the dev team forecasts the items that it can complete in the sprint. In the last episode, I told Dermot that I used to ask my team to commit to the sprint backlog during the sprint planning workshop, and I used to ask the product owner to commit to not changing the sprint goal or the contents of the sprint, but I didn't do that any longer. Well, it turns out that the word commitment was removed from a recent revision to the Scrum Guide. So the practice I was using a few years ago was valid then, but it's been removed from today's Scrum Guide. Instead, we forecast what we can complete and we remain open to possible changes. The dev team works its way through the high-value items, discussing each one and adding most of them to the sprint backlog. The team can add lower priority items such as chores, spikes, or lower value stories to reduce technical debt, to research complex challenges, or to complete predecessors to higher value stories. That process is a negotiation with the product owner, who normally comes back in at the end of part 2 to finalize the sprint backlog with the team. The dev team keeps going through the items in the product backlog and adding them to the sprint backlog until they meet the team's forecast capacity for the next sprint. My teams usually need to set aside some buffer. That buffer is for working on Sev 1 bugs, maybe providing some level 1 or level 2 support, or any unplanned company meetings or emergency non-project work that comes up during the sprint. The team and the Scrum Master need to track this non-productive time, minimize it as far as possible, but create a buffer for it when thinking about the team's capacity in this sprint. There's a relationship between velocity and capacity. Let's talk about that for a second. Velocity is a historical measure of how much work the team achieved, usually measured as story points per sprint. You can plot the velocity for each sprint on a chart, and you can measure its average, and you'll often see pretty significant variances against that average over time. Velocity tends to improve as the team gets more familiar with the Dynamics 365 system they're building. It gets faster with automation through continuous integration, continuous deployment, and test automation. And it gets faster if you bring on more team members, although there's a diminishing return there if the team gets too big. And it gets faster when the team members return from vacation. And of course, it gets slower when they go on vacation, or you recruit a less experienced team member, or when you get tangled up in technical debt. A bit like you hear on those financial investment adverts on the radio or the television, historical velocity is not a good predictor of future velocity. It's no good looking at your average velocity over the last 3 sprints and simply predicting the same velocity in the upcoming sprint. A better approach, called capacity-driven sprint planning, is to consider the known changes in the team's velocity in the current sprint, is to consider known changes in the team's capacity in the current sprint. Who's going on leave? Are there any public holidays? What chores are we going to work on to reduce technical debt that don't deliver a lot of business value? What improvements have we seen in recent automation efforts? Use the answers to these questions to forecast your capacity, and remember to leave a little bit of buffer for unplanned work. For each story, the team should have an idea of how they'll implement that story. Will they need a custom workflow activity, or is there a pre-built one in one of the workflow tools you've installed? Will you use a role-based form for a specific contact type, or just hide sections on the regular form? You don't need to stick to this particular design when you come to implement that story during the sprint, but while you've got the whole development team together, this is the perfect opportunity to use all that creative brainpower to discuss the options and come up with a design that the team thinks will work. You don't need to figure out every little detail either. It's not necessary to determine the schema names of all the custom entities or attributes during sprint planning. Get in, get out and get developing. But one thing I do like to do is to call out where different stories are likely to require work on the same entity forms. The way that my team usually work is to create a separate solution in the dev instance for each product backlog item. These are called item solutions. There's usually very little or no overlap between the solution components in each of the item solutions, but the occasional exception to this is common entity forms such as the account, contact, maybe the case, or the opportunity form. So the team calls it out during sprint planning where they think they're going to use those forms and add them to their item solutions, and they agree to coordinate their work on those forms during the daily scrum. Be careful at this stage not to assign items to developers. In an ideal world, any development team member could work on any story. The next best to that is just about anyone could implement just about anything, and the worst case is that the team relies on one person for most of the items. Or one person for a particular type of work, like testing. What do we need for sprint planning? I usually hold sprint planning in a conference room, away from our normal desks and working area. It's not impossible to hold a remote sprint planning workshop, but it's definitely much better in person. Gather everybody around a conference table where you can all see a shared screen or projector. Like most of these workshops, I strongly discourage laptops and phones. Use a whiteboard or a flip chart for notes, as well as some index cards or sticky notes. Know the team's velocity over the last 3 sprints and any forecast changes in capacity in the current sprint. Remember to check who's going on personal leave, what public holidays are coming up, and what new team members we have joining or leaving the team. That's the end of the sprint planning workshop. Here are my top 10 tips for awesome sprint planning sessions. Number 1. If your sprint planning is 4 hours or more, break it up into smaller sessions. I've described a couple of different parts to sprint planning, and the transition between the different parts can be a great time to take a 5-minute break. Number 2. The product owner should spend some time drafting his or her sprint goals before the sprint planning session. If you have a release roadmap that covers the next 3 to 6 months, you should already have some idea of what the sprint goal is for each sprint in the release. At a recent project for a university, the product owner would present the draft sprint goals on PowerPoint, and that would review the previous sprint goals and the upcoming sprint goals as well. Number 3. Everyone has to attend sprint planning. All the devs have to be there, Scrum Master has to be there, and the product owner has to be there. But if there's some kind of emergency, and for whatever reason your product owner can't attend, then it is possible to run sprint planning as best you can based on the product backlog you discussed in the last sprint review, but then consider rerunning another short sprint planning confirmation session as soon as the product owner returns and is available again. Number 4. I don't refine my product backlog items into tasks. I used to do that, but what I found is that the overhead of enumerating the tasks and estimating them isn't worth the time it takes. You can be even more productive by skipping that step altogether. Number 5. Ensure all the high-value stories meet your definition of ready before sprint planning. Use the story time session immediately before sprint planning to do this. Don't estimate stories during sprint planning. Estimating like that can kill the pace of your sprint planning workshop. Instead, save your planning poker games for story time sessions later in the sprint. Number 6. Don't fill your sprint backlog full of items to match your forecast capacity. Like I've said, keep a buffer, use it for Sev1 defects, stories more complex than estimated, or emergency leave or meetings that come up. Number 7. If you are using spikes to track research work the team needs to do, try not to complete the spike and its related story in the same sprint. For example, if you had a spike to evaluate document generation options, don't plan to implement a document generation story in that same sprint. The point of the spike is that you need to do research because you don't know what direction to take or how complex a particular piece of work is. That means the story, by definition, doesn't meet your definition of ready. Number 8. When deciding when to draw the line on the sprint backlog, you can play the Fist of 5 game. It's like paper, rock, scissors. Everyone throws out their hand at the same time. The more fingers you're holding out, the more confident you are of the team meeting its forecast and achieving the sprint goal. A fist means you've got no hope, and 5 fingers means we've got this. Keep adjusting the sprint backlog and playing fist of 5 until everyone is throwing at least 3 fingers. Number 9. It's the Scrum Master's job to modulate the dev team's forecast. Common issues I've seen in my teams are overconfidence by the dev team that they can bite off more than they can chew, or, even more common, velocity pressure from the product owner who really wants to cram in as much work as possible in every sprint. Both of those issues will show up as lots of unfinished items at the end of the sprint. Less common is a dev team that's coasting and forecasting less work than it could achieve. A great Scrum Master is able to spot these anti-patterns during sprint planning and either call them out during that sprint planning workshop or at the team's next retrospective. And finally, top tip number 10, I usually run sprint planning in the afternoon on a Tuesday, Wednesday or Thursday. The previous sprint's sprint review and sprint retrospective meetings are held in the morning, with the current sprint's sprint planning after lunch. So that lunchtime is the line between one sprint and the next. This way, all the big Scrum events are done in one day. That makes it much easier to schedule, to get everybody along, because usually the best availability for the Scrum team avoids public holidays and personal leave that most often fall on Mondays and Fridays. I'm about to start Sprint 1 for a new project in a couple of weeks. Right now, the product owner is busy building the product backlog. A couple of weeks ago, I met with the business stakeholders to draft the Dynamics 365 release roadmap for the next 18 months or so. We uncovered about 20 user roles and 70 epics to be delivered in 3 big tranches. A release roadmap is a user story map that describes what's in each release for each user role over the medium to long term, rather than a typical story map which is focused on the activities and steps in a business process. Unfortunately, for that project, the Dynamics 365 development team hasn't started yet. In fact, we've just finished recruiting them, so they weren't able to participate in that user story mapping session. But we've got an initiation week planned before Sprint 1, and during that week, we'll walk them through the release roadmap and they'll participate in storytime sessions to refine the highest priority epics into user stories. Sprint 1 kicks off on a Tuesday, and while subsequent sprints start in the afternoon, Sprint 1 will start in the morning. That just gives us an extra few hours for that first ever sprint planning workshop. I look forward to keeping you updated on how that project goes over the coming months. Dermot and I will be back in the next episode, and we'll be taking on some more of your listener questions. If you'd like to leave a question for us and hear it on the podcast, visit customery.com, that's the word customer with a Y on the end, and click on Send Voicemail button on the right-hand side of the page. I really appreciate you. Thanks for listening. Stay agile and fantastic. Our mission is to ensure that you can use the Scrum framework to successfully implement Dynamics 365. CRM audio listeners can get discounted access to the Introduction to Scrum for Dynamics 365 video training course by visiting crm.audio/Scrum Dynamics. Consider it your bonus for listening all the way to the end of each of these podcast sessions. The course features over 3 hours of video content covering the Scrum theory, roles, events and deliverables. There are case study videos where I share lessons learned from applying Scrum to my Dynamics 365 projects, and there are quizzes to test your learning and a practice exam to help you prepare for the Scrum.org Professional Scrum Master Level 1 exam. Hundreds of students have taken the Introduction to Scrum for Dynamics 365 online course. You can read some of their testimonials and find out more by visiting crm.audio/Scrum Dynamics.